time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet, 'And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel.'" Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, so that I may also go and pay him homage." When they had heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they saw the child with his mother Mary. They entered the house, and they were overwhelmed with joy, and they knelt down and paid him homage. And then, opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Today we wrap up our sermon series on Christmas people. We have been looking at the different characters of Christmas and discovering how their stories are also our stories. We have zoomed in on Zechariah and Elizabeth, the elderly parents of John the Baptist. We have spent time with Joseph and Mary, the shepherds and the angels, and even King Herod. And on this Epiphany Sunday, we ponder the wise men who journeyed from afar to find the Christ child. Now, depending on your age, you have sometime in your life received 1 or 12 or 700 different Christmas cards with 3 men with crowns on their heads riding camels with their silhouettes against the night sky, and a giant star gleaming overhead, even though we have no evidence that the wise men were kings or that there were 3 of them. We assume 3 because there were 3 different gifts. And something about these men captures our imaginations. Who were they? Where did they come from? How did they find out about a Jewish Savior? And what made them go looking for him? And we don't know any of that. But here's what we do know. We know from the Greek Matthew uses that the men were Magi, which is where we get our word magic. They practiced a form of astrology, which is the study of the movement of the stars and other celestial objects as a way to understand human events, and which is not really compatible with traditional Jewish or Christian teachings, by the way, at least not today's forms of astrology. And we know they must have come a long way from home, because nobody local, nobody even remotely familiar with the way things were in Judea, would have been naive enough to knock on Herod's front door and ask where the King of the Jews was. We talked last week about how paranoid Herod was and how he did anything it took to stay in power, including having his favorite wife and 3 of his kids killed. Where's the child who has been born King of the Jews? Are you kidding me? You don't ask Herod that. You could brainstorm for a week and you would not come up with a more threatening question to ask Herod than that. And as far as how many wise men, well, there were either a bunch of wise men or they had a sizable caravan traveling with them providing protection, because 3 men alone on the road carrying treasure chests would not have lasted long, no matter how mean and tough their camels might be. And caravans were not cheap, so these guys had some means. So here we have these wise men, however many they are, taking on the incredible expense, danger, and inconvenience of a long road trip, at least part of which had to go through treacherous desert territory, not to mention the hazards of talking to Herod. And they continue on to Bethlehem, just 5 miles south of Jerusalem, and what do when they see that the star has stopped? Everything they've been through, to what purpose? They enter the house, they kneel down, they open their treasure chests, and offer this child gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And they were overwhelmed with joy. They came all that way to give the best that they had to a toddler who could not possibly appreciate the costliness of what they offered, who had no idea who he was, what he would grow up to do, no miracles or healings to offer in return, no teachings, no words of wisdom. He couldn't even say thank you yet. Yet they gave him the best they had. Now, I can't read this story without recalling one of my favorite scenes from the classic book, The Best Christmas Pageant Ever. Anybody read that? By Barbara Robinson. I've probably quoted this book before. It was first published back in 1971, and it opens like this. The Herdmans were absolutely the worst kids in the world. They lied and stole and smoked cigars, even the girls, and talked dirty and hit little kids and cussed their teachers and took the name of the Lord in vain and set fire to Fred Shoemaker's old broken down tool house. And it continues a page later. They were just so all around awful. You could hardly believe they were real. Ralph, Imogene, Leroy, Claude, Ollie, and Gladys. 6 skinny, stringy-haired kids, all alike, except for being different sizes and having different black and blue places where they had clonked each other. The story is told from the point of view of one of Imogene Herdman's classmates, and the essence of the story is that one Sunday, all the Herdman kids show up at church because they have heard this rumor that there's going to be cake and candy in Sunday school. And they hear about the church's annual Christmas pageant and decide they want to be in it. And the other kids are so terrified of the Herdmans, they don't dare raise their hands for any of the main parts. So, Ralph and Imogene become Mary and Joseph. Leroy, Claude, and Ollie get to be the wise men, and to the horror of all the little boys assigned to be shepherds, Gladys, the youngest and meanest of all the Herdman kids, volunteers to be the angel of the Lord. The whole town is in an uproar. The Herdmans know only that Christmas is Jesus' birthday. They've never heard the Christmas story before. They're outraged to learn about King Herod, horrified by the fact that Mary has to put the baby in a feed box for animals. Imogene says she thinks Bill would have been a better name than Jesus. Gladys is delighted that the angel of the Lord gets to show up in the middle of the night and scare the shepherds half to death. And they're all disgusted to hear about the gifts that the wise men bring to Jesus. And when they learn that frankincense and myrrh are precious resins and fragrant oils, they want to know why three kings can't come up with better gifts for a baby. There is a disaster of a dress rehearsal when the fire department comes because the church ladies see smoke coming out of the women's room and don't realize it's just Imogene taking a smoke break. And then the night of the pageant arrives, and everybody comes because they want to see what will these kids do to the Christmas pageant. Ralph and Imogene show up late as Joseph and Mary. Imogene has a black eye, her veil is crooked, she's wearing giant hoop earrings. And instead of cradling the baby Jesus doll, she slumps it over her shoulder and thumps it a few times before putting him in the manger. Gladys, as the angel of the Lord, makes the most of having the only speaking part in the pageant and yells at the shepherds for all she's worth, "Hey, unto you a child is born." And the shepherds tremble because they're sore afraid of Gladys. And then finally, Leroy, Claude, and Ollie march down the aisle as the wise men. And they're not carrying the fancy bath salts jars that had always been used for the frankincense and myrrh. Instead, Leroy is struggling with something heavy. And everyone watches as he drops a large ham in front of the manger. And we learn that the ham has come from the charity Christmas food basket that the church had given to the herdmans. Still has the ribbon around it saying Merry Christmas. And what with that and a few other things, which I won't share because I don't want to spoil the book for you if you've not read it, everyone concludes this really was the best Christmas pageant ever. And at the end of the night, the herdmans refuse to take back the ham, and the narrator says, "As far as I'm concerned, Mary is always going to look a lot like Imogene Herdman, nervous and bewildered, but ready to clobber anybody who laid a hand on her baby. And the wise men are always going to be Leroy and his brothers bearing ham." And whether it's ham or gold, frankincense, and myrrh, the story of the Magi invites us to ask these questions. When it comes to giving, what does our best look like? To whom are we giving it? What does Jesus want us to give in the coming year? More and more of us are growing in our financial giving. More than 40 families and individuals in this congregation increased their pledges over and above what they pledged in 2018. And at least 10 families are pledging for the very first time. Only you know for sure if you're giving your best. But there's also our time and our talent, our energy and priorities, which are at least as valuable as our gold. When I ask myself what my best looks like, what Jesus might want me to give in the coming year, something that came to mind for me immediately was that too often I am giving the leftovers of my time and attention to my husband, not my best. And in other situations, I'm too often giving what's easy for me to give to people, what's comfortable to give to them, or what I feel obligated to give, rather than giving my very best. And too often I make that common mistake of giving my best energy to what seems urgent instead of what's really important to me. That's too bad, because when we give out of obligation and when we give out of leftovers, we will not know overwhelming joy. When the wise men offered their treasures, there was no deduction for their tax return. Their names were not included in the program or placed on a plaque for people to see. They did not receive a carefully crafted thank you note outlining all the ways their gifts made a difference. No guarantees that Mary and Joseph wouldn't take their gifts and blow them on a wild weekend in Jerusalem. Only the joy of knowing they had given their all, they had given their best to Jesus, to honor him. What a great mission, and what a fabulous purpose. What does your best look like? What part of yourself is Jesus asking you to give in the new year? As we continue living into our mission statement of loving God, loving neighbors, and living with purpose, may the wisdom of the Magi be our wisdom too. And may this church light the way like the star that led them to Christ. Amen.